October 15th, 1834. Just another autumn day in the Wind River range of what would someday become Wyoming. But for Jedediah Strong, a 32-year-old farm boy from Virginia who traded his plow for a Hawken rifle 5 years earlier, this Tuesday morning would mark the beginning of the most extraordinary test of human ingenuity and endurance in the annals of the American West. Picture this man for a moment. Strong wasn't some legendary figure like Hugh Glass or Jim Bridger, not yet, anyway. He was what you might call middle management in the fur trade hierarchy, competent enough to work alone, experienced enough to read basic weather patterns, but still hungry enough to make the kind of calculated gamble that separated the successful mountain men from the ones who ended up as anonymous bones scattered across some nameless ridge. And brother, was he gambling? The American Fur Company's summer rendezvous had wrapped up 2 months prior down on the Green River, and the numbers weren't pretty. John Jacob Astor's empire had squeezed the market so tight that beaver pelts were fetching 40% less than the previous year. 40%. Imagine if your salary got cut nearly in half overnight. That's the economic reality every trapper faced as autumn approached. Most of the smart money was heading down to winter quarters by mid-October. The truly cautious had already cached their gear and started the long journey back to civilization. But Strong? He was pushing deeper into Shoshone territory than any white man had ventured before, chasing rumors of untapped beaver streams high in the alpine country, where the air grows thin and the margin for error disappears entirely. Now, 5 years in the mountains had taught Jedediah Strong to read the signs that Mother Nature broadcasts when she's preparing something special. The elk were moving south earlier than usual, always a bad omen. Pine squirrels chattered nervously as they hoarded extra cones, their tiny brains somehow calculating that winter was coming early and staying late. Most telling of all, old Baptiste, that grizzled French-Canadian trapper who'd survived 40 winters in the high country, had warned him at rendezvous about the bone-deep ache in his joints. Baptiste's arthritis was more reliable than any farmer's almanac. But Strong laughed it off. You know how it is when you're 32 years old and think you've got the world figured out. When every successful season makes you believe you're somehow exempt from the laws of probability that claim lesser men. Strong had his reasons for confidence. His Hawken rifle was a precision instrument, his possible bag packed with 5 years' worth of accumulated wisdom, and those 3 pack horses carried enough traps to work every promising stream between here and the Continental Divide. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that 1834 would deliver one of the most brutal winters in recorded Rocky Mountain history. The kind of winter that makes meteorologists today shake their heads and reach for terms like once-in-a-century weather event. The kind of winter that turns experienced mountain men into cautionary tales. October 20th changed everything. Strong was working his trap line along Torrey Creek, checking sets he'd made the day before, when the first snowflakes began falling. Nothing unusual there. October snow was common enough at 12,000 feet elevation. But within an hour, those gentle flakes had transformed into something biblical. This wasn't weather. This was warfare. In 4 hours, visibility dropped to 10 feet. Think about that for a moment. 10 feet. You couldn't see your own hand stretched out beyond arm's length. In 8 hours, snow reached his knees, and Strong realized this wasn't some passing mountain squall. This was the real deal, arriving 6 weeks ahead of schedule with the fury of a freight train. By hour 12, the true horror began. His pack horses, those faithful companions carrying his entire fortune in traps and supplies, started screaming. If you've never heard a horse scream in terror, pray you never do. These animals, with their incredible instincts for dangerous terrain, began plunging through what looked like solid ground, but were actually snow bridges, hiding ravines, 20, 30, 40 feet deep. Strong spent 18 hours, digging through 20 feet of snow, following those terrified screams, trying to reach his supplies. When grey dawn finally revealed the aftermath, the mathematics of survival hit him like a physical blow. 2 horses dead in hidden crevasses, 1 survived but badly injured, most of his traps scattered across impossible terrain, his winter supplies buried under avalanche debris that would take weeks to excavate. if he could even find them. Let me paint you the inventory that would determine whether Jedediah Strong lived to see another spring. 1. Wool blanket, not some modern miracle fibre, but scratchy wool that would freeze solid when wet. His Hawken rifle with 19 lead balls and powder for perhaps 30 shots. Precision shooting was impossible in blizzard conditions anyway. His knife, flint and steel, a small iron pot for cooking whatever he might find, about 3 pounds of pemmican, that concentrated mixture of dried meat and fat that was basically the energy bar of the 1800s, and coiled in his possible bag like some cosmic joke, 150 feet of hemp rope he'd purchased in St. Louis for reasons that now seemed absurdly optimistic. Standing there at 12,000 feet, surrounded by peaks that wouldn't be passable until April, Strong faced a calculation that would make a modern survival expert weep. The temperature was dropping toward levels that kill exposed humans in hours. Every mountain pass leading down to survivable elevation was sealed under snow that wouldn't melt for 5 months. He had enough food for maybe a week if he stretched it. Winter was just beginning. But here's where the story gets interesting, because Jedediah Strong made a choice in that moment that separated him from the countless men who've died in similar circumstances. He didn't panic. He didn't waste energy cursing fate or wondering why he'd ignored Baptiste's warnings. Instead, he looked at that seemingly useless coil of rope and remembered something his grandmother used to say back in Virginia: "The Lord provides tools before we know their purpose." That rope was about to become the difference between legend and frozen bones scattered across the Wind River Range, because what Strong remembered next would revolutionize survival techniques across the American frontier and beyond. Strong's first week in his white prison taught him lessons that no Virginia farm boy should ever have to learn. His Hawken rifle, that precision instrument he'd trusted for 5 years, proved nearly worthless when ammunition became more precious than gold. You try hitting a snowshoe hare in blizzard conditions when you've got 19 shots to last until spring. Every missed shot wasn't just wasted powder, it was potential starvation. He tried fashioning deadfalls from scattered timber, the way every mountain man learned from reading James Ohio Patty's published adventures. Stack some rocks, prop them up with a trigger stick, bait with what little pemmican you can spare, and wait for some desperate creature to spring the trap. Sounds simple, right? Well, Strong caught exactly nothing. 0. The cold made his trigger mechanisms freeze solid. Ice made his bait invisible. Worst of all, the scent of human desperation seemed to warn away every living creature for miles. By the 8th day, starvation began its familiar, terrifying work. First comes the weakness. Simple tasks like gathering firewood become monumental efforts. Then the confusion sets in. Your brain, deprived of glucose, starts making decisions that would seem insane under normal circumstances. Finally come the hallucinations. Visions of warmth that nearly lured Strong into that fatal sleep from which mountain men never wake. On the 8th night, wrapped in his single wool blanket inside a snow cave that barely kept the wind at bay, something remarkable happened. Childhood memories surfaced unbidden, the way they do when the conscious mind stops fighting and lets deeper currents flow. Strong found himself remembering the 1829 rendezvous down on the Popo Aggie, and a conversation that had seemed utterly insignificant at the time. Yellow Hawk was his name, a Crow warrior who'd become something approaching a friend during those brief summer gatherings where white trappers and native hunters traded goods and stories. Most mountain men treated Indians as either threats or curiosities, but Strong had always been curious about techniques that kept people alive in country that killed white men regularly. Yellow Hawk had shown him something that other trappers mocked as Indian foolishness, a peculiar way of setting snares that violated every principle white men thought they understood about trapping. Instead of the simple noose snares that every frontier manual recommended, the Crow method involved creating what could only be described as mechanical contraptions using bent saplings, toggle triggers carved from specific bones, and most critically, a series of knots that would slip in precise sequences. Now, picture this from a mountain man's perspective. You're working in country where a moment's delay could mean the difference between profit and poverty. Why would you spend 10 times longer setting one elaborate trap when you could set a dozen simple ones in the same time? The other trappers at Rendezvous thought Yellow Hawk was either showing off or trying to make white men look foolish. But desperation has a way of making you remember things differently. As Strong, huddled in his snow cave, fighting off hypothermia with nothing but will and a threadbare blanket, he began to understand why Yellow Hawk's grandfather had taught him those complex techniques. Simple snares freeze solid in extreme cold. Ice coating makes them visible to wary animals who've survived previous winters by being paranoid about anything that looks unnatural. The crow design kept the noose suspended and moving, nearly invisible against swirling snow and constantly shifting positions. More importantly, the spring mechanism killed instantly, preventing struggles that attracted predators and scavengers who might steal your only meal. The rope itself became a living thing in this system, storing energy like a drawn bow. When an animal triggered the mechanism, that stored energy released with devastating efficiency. Yellow Hawk had claimed his grandfather could catch everything from field mice to white-tailed deer using variations of this single technique, adjusting only the D, trigger sensitivity and noose diameter. With trembling fingers that barely functioned in sub-zero temperatures, Strong spent 3 days learning to tie the specific knots from memory. The first attempt was a disaster. Frozen hemp doesn't behave like rope at room temperature. The second attempt looked right, but failed when he tested the trigger mechanism. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth attempts taught him increasingly creative ways to curse in languages he didn't know he knew. The seventh attempt finally worked. Strong woke on the morning of his 12th day of captivity to find a snowshoe hare hanging in his trap, its neck cleanly snapped, the body still warm enough to provide the first real meal he'd eaten since the blizzard struck. If you've never experienced true starvation, you cannot imagine the flood of emotions that accompany that first bite of life-saving protein. Relief, gratitude, and something approaching religious ecstasy all mixed together. But one rabbit doesn't make a survival strategy. That first success launched what could only be described as an obsession. Strong began expanding his network methodically, using segments of his precious rope to create multiple traps across different terrain features. Each location required careful study. Where did ptarmigan huddle during the worst storms? Which wind-blown ridges did mice travel when snow covered their usual routes? How did pine martens hunt in the maze of tunnels beneath the snowpack? He learned to read micro-terrain like a scholar reads ancient texts, finding meaning in subtle variations that would be invisible to most people. Each species required different trigger sensitivities. What worked for a heavy hare would never catch a cautious weasel. Noose heights had to be precisely calculated based on animal behavior patterns that Strong observed through careful tracking in fresh snow. The work became meditative. Each hand-carved toggle triggered a small act of defiance against the mountain's apparent determination to kill him. He used leg bones from his catches, whittling them into precisely balanced mechanisms during the long hours when blizzards made outside work impossible. Every piece of his expanding rope system served multiple purposes, not just catching animals, but creating a web of intelligence that told him where life persisted in his frozen world. The mathematics slowly shifted in his favor. 2 hares daily meant survival. 3 meant slow recovery of strength. On exceptional days, when his increasingly sophisticated trap network caught weasels or the occasional pine marten, Strong felt something approaching wealth. But winter was just beginning, and his rope trick, ridiculous as it seemed to every principle of frontier survival, was about to face tests that would determine whether ingenuity could triumph over the raw physics of an 8-month Rocky Mountain. Winter. The real challenges were still coming. By December, something extraordinary had happened. Jedediah Strong had transformed from prey to predator in a landscape that should have killed him months earlier. His rope network had grown into something that would make a modern systems engineer weep with admiration, a web of interconnected survival mechanisms covering nearly a square mile of mountainside, each component precisely calibrated for maximum efficiency in conditions that defied human survival. But success breeds its own problems, and Strong's trapline had become so productive that it attracted what you might call unintended consequences. His catches drew scavengers. Foxes learned to follow his routes, stealing kills before he could collect them. Ravens announced successful traps with their distinctive calls, creating a dinner bell for every predator within miles. The ecosystem around Strong's operation had evolved to depend on his ingenuity, which meant he now faced competition from creatures far better adapted to winter warfare than any Virginia farm boy had a right to be. The legendary Night of Seven Wolves occurred in late January, when a desperate pack discovered Strong's trapline during the deepest cold snap of the winter. Picture this scenario: temperatures so low that spit freezes before it hits the ground, and 7 starving wolves who've learned that following the strange scent patterns left by this peculiar two-legged creature leads to easy meals. Strong spent 14 hours in a deadly chess match, using rope configurations he invented on the spot, trip lines connected to log deadfalls that could crush a wolf's spine, noose traps set at wolf head height along their predictable travel routes. He even constructed what might have been the first rope bridge in Rocky Mountain history, allowing him to move between trees while the pack circled below like furry sharks, testing every approach route with the patience that only truly desperate predators possess. The economic reality of his situation had become clear through meticulous record-keeping that would have impressed a Philadelphia banker. Strong tracked everything: construction time, success rates, caloric returns, even the weather conditions that affected trap performance. Each snare required approximately 2 hours to construct properly, but lasted weeks with minor maintenance. The mathematics of survival had become as precise as any business calculation. Mousetraps succeeded 70% of the time but yielded minimal calories, barely enough to justify the energy expenditure of checking them. Hair snares worked 40% of attempts but provided a full day's sustenance when successful. The crown jewel of his operation was the marten sets, which succeeded only 20% of the time, but provided rich meat plus pelts worth $8 each at rendezvous prices. $8. When a laborer earned $1 for a full day's work, a single marten pelt represented more than a week's wages. Strong had become a survival accountant, calculating energy expenditure against probable returns with the precision that would make modern efficiency experts proud. He learned to read his own body like a ledger book, how much protein he needed to maintain strength versus how much risk he could afford in checking distant trap lines during blizzards. His most ingenious innovation came from observing how native women processed sinew. By carefully unraveling sections of his precious hemp rope, Strong created hair-thin snares, nearly invisible even to the keen-eyed weasels that had evaded his larger traps. These micro-snares caught voles and mice that became crucial protein sources during the leanest weeks, when larger game seemed to vanish entirely from his frozen world. Think about the psychology of this situation for a moment. Most people, faced with gradually diminishing rope, would hoard every strand. Strong did the opposite. He invested his capital, breaking down his most precious resource to create specialized tools for specific problems. This kind of strategic thinking separated the survivors from the statistics in frontier America. He learned to read incoming storms like a ship's captain reads the sea, knowing exactly when to check traps before they buried under fresh snow. The rope had evolved from mere cordage into an extension of his will, each strand carrying specific purpose and meaning. Different sections served different functions: thick rope for deadfall triggers, medium rope for standard snares, thin strands for the delicate micro-traps that caught the smallest prey. The grisly encounter in early March tested everything Strong had learned about survival engineering. This bear, desperate from its own winter hunger, had discovered Strong's cached pelts, his accumulated wealth from months of successful trapping. Rather than risking his precious ammunition on a creature that could absorb multiple rifle shots and still kill him, Strong engineered what might have been the most elaborate trap in frontier history. The project took 6 days of careful preparation. Using principles he'd learned from Yellowhawk's toggle system, Strong created trigger mechanisms sensitive enough to spring from a bear's weight, yet stable enough to survive mountain winds that could knock a man off his feet. The deadfall itself required moving logs that weighed hundreds of pounds, positioning them with the precision of an engineer building a bridge. When that grizzly finally triggered the trap, 400 pounds of carefully balanced timber crashed down with enough force to stun a locomotive. The impact didn't kill the bear immediately, but slowed it enough for Strong to use just 2 of his precious bullets, a calculated risk that paid off in spectacular fashion. That bear provided meat for 3 weeks, and a hide that became his second blanket, doubling his insulation against temperatures that regularly dropped below -30 degrees. By winter's end, Strong had taken over 200 animals using variations of his rope system, everything from tiny voles to that massive grizzly. His accumulated pelts represented more wealth than most trappers earned in 2 profitable seasons. But more importantly, he'd developed survival techniques that would revolutionize frontier methodology for generations to come. The rope had taught him something profound about human adaptability. When conventional wisdom failed, when standard techniques proved inadequate, when survival demanded innovation beyond normal parameters, the combination of desperate necessity and patient observation could create solutions that seemed impossible to those who'd never faced similar extremes. Spring was coming, but Strong's greatest challenge still lay ahead. How does one man transport 200 pounds of perfectly preserved winter pelts down a mountain that had nearly killed him just for being there? April brought the sound that Jedediah Strong had prayed for through 8 months of isolation, the musical trickle of running water beneath melting ice. Spring's arrival in the high country doesn't come gently like it does in civilized places. It arrives with the violence of a dam bursting, turning peaceful streams into raging torrents and stable snow bridges into death traps that could swallow a man without a trace. But freedom came with its own impossible mathematics. Strong faced a logistical problem that would challenge a modern expedition team. How could one man transport 200 pounds of perfectly preserved winter pelts down 12,000 feet of treacherous mountain terrain? Those pelts represented a fortune, but they were useless if he couldn't get them to market. Dead men don't spend money, and the descent presented dangers that made his winter survival look simple by comparison. The answer, once again, lay in his rope. Strong had spent months observing how native peoples moved heavy loads across difficult terrain, and now he applied those lessons with the precision of a mechanical engineer. He created what modern backpackers wouldn't see for another century, a sophisticated harness system that distributed weight across his entire body rather than concentrating it on his shoulders and spine. Using techniques learned from watching Shoshone women pack camp equipment, Strong wove hemp into a framework that turned his torso into a living pack frame. The system included a tump line across his forehead, chest straps that engaged his core muscles, and hip belts that transferred weight to his stronger leg muscles. Every pound was precisely balanced to maintain his center of gravity on slopes, where a single misstep meant 1,000-foot fall into oblivion. But weight distribution was only part of the challenge. Strong needed mobility on terrain that would test an unloaded climber. He crafted snowshoes from bent willow branches and rawhide cut from his precious pelts, each pair representing $8 in lost revenue, but absolutely essential for crossing snowfields that could still swallow him completely. The bindings used cordage techniques he'd perfected during his months of trap construction, creating shoes that would hold together under conditions that destroyed inferior equipment. The descent became a masterpiece of expedition planning. Strong cached supplies at strategic intervals, using his rope to lower packs down cliff faces that couldn't be safely climbed while loaded. He constructed what amounted to a primitive pulley system at the most dangerous points, allowing him to rappel down sections while controlling his precious cargo separately. 12 days of careful navigation through melting snow and avalanche zones tested every survival skill he'd developed. Each morning brought new challenges: snow bridges that looked solid but concealed deadly crevasses, ice fields that turned into waterfalls without warning, rock slides triggered by temperature changes that could crush a man like an insect. On May 2nd, 1835, something walked into the American Fur Company's advance camp on the Green River that challenged every witness's understanding of what human beings could endure. Jedediah Strong had hair grown past his shoulders, clothes patched with fur scraps in patterns that defied conventional tailoring, and skin weathered to leather by 8 months of high-altitude exposure. But his eyes blazed with the fierce intelligence of a man who'd solved problems that killed other people. When he dropped his massive pack and began pulling out prime winter pelts, seasoned trappers gathered in the kind of amazed silence usually reserved for resurrections. Winter fur commanded premium prices because it was nearly impossible to obtain. Most animals either migrated to lower elevations or grew thick coats that were ruined by spring shedding. Strong's catch represented nearly $4,000 in 1835 currency, a fortune when common laborers earned $1 for a full day's back-breaking work. $4,000. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman might earn $300 annually. Strong had accumulated more wealth in one winter than most men saw in a decade. But the money was only part of the story that spread through the rendezvous like wildfire. At first, seasoned trappers scoffed at his rope tricks. Jim Bridger himself supposedly examined Strong's toggle mechanisms and declared, "Any fool can tie a snare." Hugh Glass, the legendary survivor of the bear attack, dismissed the techniques as too much work for too little gain. These were men who'd built reputations on conventional frontier wisdom, and Strong's methods challenged everything they thought they knew about mountain survival. But when Strong demonstrated the crow toggle system in action, showing how it worked in freezing conditions when normal snares failed completely, skepticism transformed into fascination faster than a spring avalanche. Within 2 seasons, variations of what became known as the Strong system appeared throughout the Rocky Mountains. The Hudson's Bay Company incorporated his techniques into their official trapping manual, distributed to company men from Oregon Territory to Hudson Bay. Kit Carson reportedly claimed Strong's methods saved his life during the brutal winter of 1838. Joseph Walker used modified versions of the rope harness system during his California expeditions. Even the legendary Jedediah Smith, no relation despite the similar first name, adopted Strong's cache techniques for his own high-altitude operations. Strong himself profited both financially and socially from his ordeal. He sold his survival techniques as a complete package: detailed instructions, carved bone toggles, specific rope recommendations, even training courses for greenhorn trappers. Mountain men who'd mocked Indian foolishness now paid good money to learn those same techniques from a white man who'd proven their effectiveness under conditions that had killed others. He married the daughter of a St. Louis merchant, using his fur profits to establish a wilderness outfitting store that became the primary supplier for expeditions heading west. But prosperity never erased the mountain's lessons. Until his death in 1871, Strong kept a coil of hemp rope hung by his door, the same rope that had meant the difference between legend and frozen bones scattered across the Wind River Range. Neighbors reported that he would sometimes hold that rope while staring west toward mountains only he could see, perhaps remembering the weight of snow and the sound of wind and the precise mathematics of survival that had transformed a desperate farm boy into a frontier legend. His grandson donated that rope to the Museum of Westward Expansion, where it remains today, 150 feet of hemp that once carried the difference between life and death. Modern survival experts study Strong's techniques, finding principles that apply to everything from Arctic expeditions to space station emergency protocols. The rope trick that seemed ridiculous to his contemporaries now appears in military survival manuals worldwide, proof that innovation often wears the mask of absurdity until desperation reveals its genius. Sometimes the most extraordinary human achievements come not from conquering nature, but from learning to work with it using tools that others dismiss as impossible. Jedediah Strong's 8-month winter proved that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about adapting, innovating, and discovering that the difference between legend and tragedy sometimes comes down to one simple question: what can you do with a rope when everything else has failed?